If you start.
Okay. Yeah, let's get started. 27. Yeah, so welcome everybody. I hope everybody's set up and can hear me properly. My name is Robbert de Witt. I'm an editor for Elsevier Weekblad. I think, like so many here attending, I'm fascinated by the US and US politics. I write about it quite often. And I was kindly asked by the Atlantic Commission to be your digital host today. Of course, the most important person attending today is Matt Meyer. Matt is president of the Ohio-based think tank Opportunity Ohio, and he appears regularly in the media commenting about US politics. And it's not just American media, also in the Dutch media, since he wrote a few times for Elsevier. I met Matt several times in the US, but also, and I think also like many of us here, at events organized by the Atlantic Commission. Matt's knowledge of American politics is for me simply amazing. Every time I talk to him, I'm stunned by the amount of facts he has ready. He has clear insights, and I think it's insights I don't always hear, read, or see in the Dutch media. So I think we will have quite an interesting hour. I only fear that 1 hour might not be enough for Matt, but we will see how it goes. First, I will ask Matt to tell us something about what's actually going on at the moment in the US, and perhaps he can also tell a little bit what he expects the coming 4 months, leading all the way up to Election Day in November. After that, I have a few questions for Matt, and we can move on to questions from the audience. And I'm quite sure that during the conversation, some more questions will pop up, and we will have time for those too. But now I would like to share the view and give the screen to Matt. Please, warm welcome.
Well, thank you, Robert. It's always good to join you guys over in the Netherlands, because sometimes I try to get there once a year. Don't know if it's going to happen or not this year because of the coronavirus and the restrictions on travel. So, but hopefully we'll see what happens in the coming months. So Robert said I have a lot of facts. Some would call it fake news. It just depends on your perspective, I suppose, and where you come from. But I'll do my best to give you what I think are the facts on the ground here in the U.S. presently, as I see them in Ohio, which is really what we call flyover country in the middle of America. This is where I live, I work. So I think I have a pretty good idea of what's going on in terms of the pulse of places like Ohio versus New York, California. Those aren't really places I spend much time these days. So we are about 4 months out from the presidential election, as well as the U.S. Senate election for a third of the Senate, which will determine who controls it going forward, as well as every House member is up for election as well, several governors. But the big one is obviously President Trump and Joe Biden, former Vice President Joe Biden, and what happens with them. But I will say to you, it's equally important of what happens in the U.S. Senate, given that determines who gets on the Supreme Court over the next 4 years or not. So let's talk about where things stand today. I think it's pretty conventional wisdom right now that Biden is up and Trump is down. I would caution anybody to put a lot of emphasis on national polling. So when you see polls coming out that are national sample, I wouldn't focus on those. You can, but the problem with national polls is we don't have a national election. So what people in California, New York, Illinois think doesn't really matter from an electoral college standpoint, which is how we elect the president. And so the more interesting polls will be the state-based polls in places like Ohio, Florida, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Wisconsin, Arizona, Iowa, New Hampshire. Those are what we call battleground states. And we call them that because if you look back over, let's say, the last 6-7 presidential elections, there are certain states that have gone for the Democrat, regardless of who it is, every single time. And there are certain states that have gone for the Republican, no matter who it is, every single time. So those states aren't going to change up in 2020. You're going to see, your blue states like California, New York, Illinois go for Biden, and you'll see your red states like Utah, Alabama, Mississippi go for Trump. That's just the way the world works here in the U.S. in terms of the political swing. Those battleground states, the 7 to 10 states, those are the ones that will decide who wins the presidency and gets to the 270 electoral votes required under our Constitution to become president. So that's where the fight will be over the next 4 months. For those of you who've heard me speak before, you'll hear me refer to places, websites from time to time. To watch the polling data, there's a great website called realclearpolitics.com. It's all one word. They have on the right-hand side of the webpage, they have a compilation that's ongoing where they fill in the national polling, but also more important, the state-based polling, and they'll show what is the current average polling for those states. That will allow you to keep a real close eye on what's happening in our battleground states as the election unrolls over the coming 4 months. So watch realclearpolitics.com if you want to keep an eye on the polling data, because that's what that will matter. Let me talk a little bit about Joe Biden. So I don't know if you saw a polling data come out yesterday that shows about 40% of voters think he has at least early stage dementia, if not worse. That will obviously impact the coming 4 months. If the impression of Joe Biden increases among people thinking he has dementia, because Americans will be very worried about putting someone with dementia into the presidency, given the pressure. And everybody here kind of knows that they've watched now Barack Obama, George W. Bush, Bill Clinton age tremendously in their 4 to 8 years that they were in office, right? They came in looking young and healthy, and they left gray and wrinkled because there's just so much stress in the presidency. Trump came in looking that way, so he hasn't changed that much because he was already old when he started. So he's just old to begin with. So, but that concerns people. They know the pressure of the presidency. So that'll be something that you need to watch. One also thing to keep in mind. One of the reasons I think that Joe Biden is ahead in the polls is because he has, for many voters that are the swing voters, not your hardcore Democrat or hardcore Republican, but that 20% in the middle that will swing between the parties. I think he has become kind of an empty vessel where they're putting all their kind of hopes and aspirations of the anti-Trump. He won't be like Trump. But I don't think they really know much about Joe Biden, even though he was vice president, because he's kind of been off the radar for a few years. And with the coronavirus, he's now been in his basement and trying to do some stuff. But I think, they've kept him at a low profile, which is probably a good idea, because when he goes on, it doesn't tend to go well. When he does kind of, big events, he doesn't sound well. He stumbles, he forgets things. He says things like, we've had 120 million coronavirus deaths in the US, which is of course not close to the reality. So I think that right now that you see him becoming kind of an anti-Trump vessel, and we'll see if that maintains over the coming 4 months when he actually has to come out of the basement, when he has to sit on a stage with Donald Trump for 3 different debates. And you just have to keep in mind, you may not like Trump, but Joe Biden will not be better than Hillary Clinton in debating. Hillary Clinton was very good at that. And Donald Trump really did a number on her. So nobody expects Biden to walk into those debates and walk out the victor. And so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out once the two men are together debating each other. So that's that. Let's talk a little bit about all this Black Lives Matters, the protests, the riots, the tearing down of statues, the changing of names. I live in a place called Dublin, Ohio, but it's a suburb of the city of Columbus, named after Christopher Columbus. They've already taken down the statue of Christopher Columbus, and there's a current petition that has over 100,000 signatures to change the name of the city to Flavortown after Guy Fieri, who is I don't know if you know, he's a Food Network chef. But it's those kind of silly debates that we're now having of, should we change the name of our city because it was named after Christopher Columbus. And those things are unrolling all over the U.S. right now. And nobody knows how those things are going to unfold. There is that moment where if they go too far, you start creating problems in your suburbs among voters who really don't feel comfortable with the direction. And, one of the things that has been surprising is that Joe Biden has been relatively silent on criticizing the protest or the riots or the taking down of statues beyond the Confederacy. He's clearly said we should get rid of these Confederate generals that we put statues up in the southern states back in the 1910s and 20s and 30s. But he has said nothing about tearing down Washington, George Washington, or Thomas Jefferson, or some of the other statues that they're now tearing down. And that's going to strike Americans is problematic. And in just this morning, the official Twitter for the Democrat National Party tweeted that, Mount Rushmore, which is this famous, it's actually behind me, it's this famous massive statue out in South Dakota that was carved in the 1940s of the four of the presidents, Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, and Teddy Roosevelt. That's a symbol of white supremacy. That was by the actual Democrat National Party. And most Americans just aren't going to agree with that. They're going to find that to be offensive. And so they took down their Twitter, the tweet after they put it up, but people already got screenshots of it, so it's already out there. That kind of stuff is going to create what those of you like Gert Timmerman, who's a bit on the older side, remember from the 1960s, was the 1968 riots and what happened with what became the silent majority, right? These folks that voted for Nixon, Richard Nixon, because they didn't like some of the anti-American stuff that was coming out of the 1968 protest that had occurred back then. And so I think there is going to be a silent majority, and in America that doesn't mean popular vote anymore. That just means electoral college. And so the question becomes, does that silent majority give Trump enough to get re-election or not? And that's going to be very interesting. The second component, I wrote about this, I read a weekly column for the Spectator USA. And one of the columns I wrote is, can Trump get a meaningful number of African-American voters? Latest polling data, he has between a 30 and 40% approval rating with African-Americans as of today. Some people think that's surprising because he's been painted as a racist, but he's not. But more importantly, there's lots of things he's done for the African-American community that other folks haven't done. So for example, he got criminal justice reform done, which was a major reform of how we treat our criminal justice system that impacts the Black community. He has increased funding substantially to historical Black colleges in America. And he's done some other things like that. And what I wrote about was, I called it the silent minority of the minority. No Republican is going to get 50% of the Black vote in my lifetime. That's just not going to happen. Typically in a presidential election, they vote between 90 and 94% with the Democrats. And so in the 2016 election, Trump got 8%. Now, if he's polling at 30 to 40% approval, I don't think that'll translate into 30 to 40% of the Black vote. But if he can get up to 12 to 15%, so increase his percentage by 4 to 7%, the math on that is interesting, because if he can do that in places like Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Florida, it makes it actually really difficult for the Democrats to find votes to replace those lost voters in other parts of the electorate, because Trump already has the Democrat white blue collar voter that he's not going to lose in 2016. So they're going to have to get new people to the polls, which they always put their hopes on the young, your millennial, your age, 18 to 30 to vote. But those folks are historically horrible voters. They say they're going to vote, but then they actually don't. So I'll be curious to see if Trump can actually pull out 12 to 15% of the Black vote, which would then make it really mathematically difficult for the Democrat candidate to win the presidency, given the way the Electoral College shakes out here in the U.S. Let's talk for a second about what the general election here will be focused on. And it will be pretty clear that it will focus on three things. One will be the economy, right? We saw massive devastation to the economy because of the shutdown. We're coming back. We're seeing really impressive numbers, but will those numbers last? If they last, that's going to obviously help Trump in terms of his argument that he, made America great once before. He can MAGA 2.0, so to speak. Just historical standpoint, only 3 presidents have not won re-election in the last 100 years. Herbert Hoover in 1932 because of the Great Depression, Jimmy Carter in 1980 because of the Great Malaise, and then George H.W. Bush in 1992 because it's the economy stupid that James Carville famously uttered that helped Bill Clinton, as well as Ross Perot, siphon off 19% of the vote that probably would have gotten Bush reelected to some degree. Other than that, incumbents have gotten reelected. And so the economy really is the weak spot for an incumbent. So if the economy can come back strong enough to a certain point, I think it'll put Trump in the driver's seat for reelection. If it does not come back, then I think it's going to create a virtual impossible hurdle for him to overcome among voters, because it's people vote with their pocketbook, as we say, and if the pocketbook isn't doing well, they blame the incumbent, and that's just the way that the cookie crumbles. The second big issue is going to be China. I wrote a piece about this where I talked about the 3 hits from China over the last 20 years, on the battleground states: Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. That's the focal point, right? In those places, first because of China's entry into WTO, and then its mercantile approach to trade, its stealing of intellectual property, and all those types of things, we literally saw plants here disassembled, shipped over to China, and reassembled, and 1,500, 2,000 people lost their job in cities in places like Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. So first, in the early aughts, the 2000 to 2010, you saw this loss of jobs that people blame on China. Then, right as those folks were kind of hitting rock bottom, we saw the influx of fentanyl out of China, which is the drug that has helped spike the opioid deaths at about 50,000 a pop per year in the U.S., which they expect to go on for the next decade. So we're going to lose 500,000 Americans because of drug overdoses related to fentanyl and opioids. And much of that fentanyl is coming out of China. So in places like Ohio, that was very hard hit. That again became yet another, a chemical virus that was sent over by China. And then, of course, this latest thing, the virus that has come out of Wuhan, that has resulted in lots of death and people being sick and the economy being shut down. People here blame China. They don't blame the Chinese people. It's not a xenophobic or racist thing. They blame the Chinese government for what it failed to do and hid and didn't share, and its response that has resulted in things happening here that people are frustrated with. And so China is going to become a key component in the election. And in that fight, again, I think Trump has the better position because he has really been almost singular among national politicians over the last decade for going after China and China's trade imbalance and what it does. And Biden has been the opposite of that. There's lots of quotes that Biden has given about China's not a threat, China's not an enemy, China's, a good this and that. And that's going to be, those clips are going to get played again in places like Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Florida, and you name it. So I think China's going to become a growing issue, and it's a growing threat, I think, not just to the U.S., frankly, but to Europe and lots of other places, given its kind of bent on trying to control more and more of the world and take more and more of the Pacific Rim under its control. The third is going to be the pandemic response, and that's probably where that Trump is going to have his weakest and most vulnerable area because, there's lots of debate here of whether his response was effective or not. I mean, on one hand, he shut down travel from China early and was called xenophobic for doing so, and then he shut down travel from Europe when Europe started to spike. On the other hand, there's been some problems with the lag in testing and some of the things that took too much time to get done. But today, the U.S. tests more than anybody else has tested, and we're seeing an increase in positive tests now. But we're not seeing a comparable increase in hospitalizations, and we're seeing a continued decrease in the death rate here on a daily basis. So unless that changes, that's going to be kind of he said, she said fight between, or he said fight between Biden and Trump, and we'll see how that plays out ultimately. So those are the kind of the three core issues that I think they'll fight over during the general election that really will ramp up after Labor Day here in the U.S., which is around September 3rd, typically. So just keep your eye on those issues. And then here are a couple curveballs, and then we can get to questions, Robert, if that's fine. Here's some curveballs to keep in mind that nobody knows what's going to happen. Number one is this Durham investigation, which for those of you who don't know, he is a U.S. attorney who is investigating the use of the Steele dossier and all of the stuff that happened that led to the Russia investigation that turned out to be much ado about nothing. More and more of that is leaking out. He has impaneled a grand jury, we know, and so we expect indictments to happen of, former Obama folks. We just don't know how high that's going to go. Obviously, last week, a note came out from a guy named Peter Strzok, who was one of the kind of dirty FBI guys that was involved in that thing, and his note seemed to indicate that Joe Biden was involved to some degree, and it was pushing the Logan Act to get General Michael Flynn. And that Barack Obama was quoted as saying, make sure to get the right people on that, which people here interpret to mean not, to get the people that will go after Trump. And that's going to, again, cause some issues. So we'll see where that plays out. The next is going to be, what does China do with Hong Kong? If it continues to push Hong Kong aggressively, that's going to cause a Western response that, again, could create a dynamic that nobody knows how that plays out in our presidential election. Iran is always floating out there. I think yesterday they went for Trump to be a war criminal because of his taking down of Soleimani a couple months back. We'll see what happens there. The protest, again, as I mentioned, I don't know if those are going to get hotter in the summer or they're going to cool down. What happens in the fall, what happens at the Milwaukee Democrat Convention, what happens at the Republican Convention in Jacksonville. All those things are just, we don't know if there is, again, either an overreaction by the law enforcement or an overreaction by the protest rioters that turn the American public one way or the other. That's going to be a great question mark. And finally, this is going to sound completely silly, but one issue that is going to be out there is what happens with the U.S. sports programs and kids getting back to school. Those two things are going to cause issues. If the kids don't get back to school come fall and they're sitting at home and therefore parents can't go back to work and get their jobs, that's going to create some problems that we don't know how it's going to play out. And, Americans love their sports. And right now we've been kind of in a sports deficit for several months. And we're looking at restarting the NBA, restarting the Major League Baseball. We got football coming along, college football, which is a big deal here for our universities. And what we're seeing is as everyone starts to try to ramp up, they're seeing a spike in coronavirus positive tests, which I think we're only going to shut things down. And again, it's just hard to say how the American public will react to having another 4 months without being distracted by things like sports or movies and the kind of stuff that they're used to just doing and kind of life getting back to normal. So we'll see how that impacts voters as they head to the polls back in November. So kind of, Robert, that's all I have. Now we can do whatever questions you want for as long as you guys want.
Okay, thank you, Matt. Interesting. What strikes me, you mentioned three big issues for the campaign: economy, China, and pandemic response. And afterwards, you mentioned the violence in the cities and the racial tensions. I was quite surprised, actually, because looking from the other side of the ocean, it seems racial tensions seems to be all that matters at the moment in the US, perhaps even more than the pandemic response. Is this wrong? And second, I suppose many Americans feel that the president should be somebody who brings people together after the campaign. He doesn't seem to succeed here if you look at his response for the tensions in the major cities.
Yeah, so let me talk a little bit about that. So Trump is definitely not a uniter. That's just not his skill. Right. But in fairness, I'm not sure anybody can be a uniter in America today. We are so polarized along partisan lines, right? Where you are either you believe Barack Obama was the worst guy in the world, or you believe he walked on water, and you believe either Trump is, the most the devil incarnate, or you believe he is the second coming of Reagan. And so I think even if Joe Biden were to win, you're not going to see somehow the country come together around Joe Biden. You're going to see the 40% that are the hardcore Trump kind of conservative Republican spend the next 4 years going after Biden with the same venom and vehemence that the left came after Trump for the last 3 years. So I think it's going to get worse, actually, no matter who wins. But no, Robert, it's an accurate judgment to say that the pandemic has taken a backseat to the racial unrest. And what's interesting about that is, the data does not support the Black Lives Matter movement. Let me explain that. If you look at the data, police officers are not killing unarmed Black men in the way that the media or Black Lives Matter portray it. They actually kill more unarmed white men and armed white men than they do Black men in a given year. Where there is a disconnect is in the number of Black males who are being killed by other Black males every day in America. That is where there is, frankly, a pandemic. Every weekend you see the numbers coming in a place like Chicago, Baltimore, New York, where you're seeing 10, 12, 13 people killed, another 20 wounded, which is largely Black on Black crime occurring in the urban centers in America. That is the problem that needs to get solved. And what's interesting about that, right, is that's where that silent minority of the minority come from. They know the police keep their cities safe as they can be. They know where the violence is coming from. And so when you see the left start talking about defund the police or, get rid of the police, that it becomes very unpopular, frankly, among African Americans who know that the police are what keep them and have kept them safe over the last 2 decades. I mean, when you think about the advent of the broken windows theory, that is what was used by Rudy Giuliani when he was mayor, and then other mayors to kind of reform our cities in a way that made them far more safer than they have been. When you see the violence coming back up, the studies show that because of the police and those policies, they frankly saved thousands of lives of Black Americans because they weren't killed when they would have been if we hadn't gotten crime under control in those cities. And so that disconnect is playing out more and more, and you're hearing more African American leaders talk about how the Black Lives Matter movement is disconnected from the reality. They don't seem to care about the Black lives that are being killed every weekend in your major cities. All they care about are the ones that are being killed by cops, which frankly isn't that many in a given year, compared to, again, there's far more white men killed by the cops in a given year. So, and those stats you can find on the Department of Justice website. They put out all the data every year, and you can look back and see for yourself. You don't have to believe me on it. So I'll be curious to see how that plays out, Robert, in the coming weeks and months in terms of this narrative that is not consistent with what the facts seem to show.
But of course, there's a difference between absolute numbers and relative numbers, right?
So let's say, I think in 2019, there were, I think there was 1,109 police killings of people. Of those, I think there were 200 and something that were African American, and there were over 400 white people killed. Of those, I think 10 were unarmed Blacks. Of 9 out of the 10 unarmed Blacks had, meaning no guns. They had come after the cops. They were trying to take the tasers. They were trying to take their guns. So they got killed in that melee. So at any rate, so the numbers are not supportive of kind of this idea that America's cops are just a bunch of racists looking to take out any unarmed Black man that they can. It's not borne out by the data.
Okay. Another question. Until the pandemic broke out, his major selling point was the economy, I suppose. It was doing better than last decades. But now, of course, the economy is doing less. Maybe it will pick up, maybe it won't. But besides the economy, what is his major re-election message? I remember last week, the Wall Street Journal had a comment, an op-ed about his re-election campaign, and they wrote, besides his old grievances, he has no message. What do you think about this?
Yeah, he doesn't have a message. And that's a major criticism from folks like me and others on the right to say, you better figure out your message, because people don't vote for yesterday, they vote for tomorrow. And right now he's not giving them the tomorrow message. So hopefully he'll put that together at some point. But no, Robert, you're right. He's not yet articulated what is his plan for the next 4 years, other than, I guess, MAGA 2.0. But I don't think that's going to be enough to get voters where they want to be.
Okay, and his opponent, Joe Biden, you said he's sitting in the basement. Somebody from the audience wanted to know, is this perhaps the best strategy for Mr. Biden to beat Trump, besides the debates he will still has to face Mr. Trump, but until that time, just waiting it out and let Donald Trump make his mistakes? Do you think this is a good strategy, or is this no strategy?
It's a great strategy. I mean, especially because given Biden's stumbles, and if there really is a early dementia problem that's going on, keeping him out of the limelight is a smart move on the left part. So it is smart. And right now, Trump is doing lots of stuff to shoot his own foot. So, you know, that's what they say. If your opponent's doing themselves harm, then get out of their way. And so, yeah, I think it's a smart move. But they won't be able to keep doing it. They're going to have to bring him out of the basement at some point, and then we'll see what happens in terms of the polling numbers.
Okay. So about Mr. Biden, I think there are many in Europe who hope that Mr. Biden will win, since he might be good for transatlantic relationships. I mean, it can't go any worse than with Mr. Trump. That's how people feel. What do you think about Mr. Biden and transatlantic relationships?
Yeah, look, I think there is little doubt that Biden will be more of a Davos internationalist president, and Trump simply isn't. I mean, he doesn't think much of the Davos crowd. He thinks Europe isn't doing enough to pay its own freight for its own defense. You know, and so I think things would definitely improve. But I will tell you, there is a majority sentiment in America that Europe doesn't do enough to defend itself, that Germany and France have trade policies that are unfair to the American worker and American goods, whether it's the farmers in France that are kept out by the cap, or it's, you know, Germans, you know, approach to how it does things that keeps our, you know, we have 10% tariffs on all of our cars, things like that. So I think that's going to change. And, you know, the whole fight over Nord Stream 2 is an important fight. I mean, but Europe wants America to spend all this money on NATO to defend against Russia, that is the mission of NATO, while Germany is essentially getting in bed with them on a pipeline that will make Germany more reliant upon Russia, put petrodollars into Putin's pocket that Putin will then use around the globe to undermine the West. So there is a disconnect for many Americans when they look at, well, what does Europe want? I mean, do they want to be protected from Russia, or do they want to get in bed with Russia? Because we're confused by what we see out of Nord Stream 2. It's not just a pipeline. That's not a fair characterization, because it's going to fund Putin and his way he does business for years to come. So I don't think that's going to change even if Biden gets in office. The problem for Europe is going to be is if they do what they're doing, which is right now they've taken the approach of, let's kick Trump to the curb and we'll outlast him and he'll lose in November and then everything will go back to normal. And they kind of better hope that happens, because if he wins re-election and they've done that, he's taking names on who did that, and he's going to come down on them harder than you can imagine from a position of strength at that point. So I'd be very careful if I were the leaders of Europe on how much they want to try to kick him to the curb over the next 4 months, with the hope that, you know, the wisdom of the American people will bear out and somehow he won't win re-election. I think that's a gamble. He seems to win no matter what. You know, one of your the listeners talked about the sex scandals, that, you know, all this stuff about what Trump does, and it doesn't seem to hurt him. and it's a fair point. He has this kind of Teflon on him. I wouldn't bet against Trump right now, especially with Biden as the opponent. And I say that knowing he's down in all the polls. So it's a real gamble for Europe of how far they want to push Trump to the side over the next 4 months, with the hope that Biden walks in and puts things back to the Davos international order, the way we all liked it, kind of thing.
So do you also think there's a lot of support for his withdrawal from Germany?
I do. I mean, look, step back for a minute, right? And this is where we got to think about history, right? Americans remember vividly Gerhard Schroeder and Jacques Chirac in 2003 campaigning for re-election in their countries on a virulent anti-American platform. And that was all about the Iraq War, but they did so in a manner that was just very, very jingoistic against the American people. There is growing sentiment that Germany is anti-American. And the polling data supports that, right? The German people are not fans of America. And so, I think that's a growing problem that I'm not sure how that gets fixed.
Okay. Do you think like 4 years ago, you mentioned the pollings before, which are not looking good, the nationwide pollings, and we should look at the battleground states. First, are the polls look better in the battleground states? I don't think they really are for Mr. Trump. And second, even if they don't look very well, do you think media, perhaps in the US, but also here in Europe, are again underestimating his ability to get out the vote and overestimating Mr. Biden's ability to get out the vote?
So the polling data in the battleground states is better than the national polling data, right? I think you have the national poll showing down 10 to 14 points. And then state battlegrounds, he's either up a little bit or he's down a little bit. And the issue for the polling data is, lots of polls were wrong in 2016. And so the question becomes, when the pollsters do their polling, are they sampling properly? Are they oversampling Democrat voters, or are they undersampling Republican voters? Are they reaching lots of Americans have disconnected. Like, I don't have a landline in my home anymore and haven't for years. So the only way to reach me, to survey me, is to get my cell phone. And that's really expensive. So polling companies tend to not be as thorough on cell phone, tracking cell phone voters. And so therefore you're skewing your voting population. And so the question becomes, how accurate are the polls? And then the final piece becomes, we saw this in 2016. There is a Trump undervote, meaning people don't want to tell pollsters they're voting for him, but they do. Is that 10%? God, no. Is it 3 to 5%? Maybe. Is it going to be bigger this time than last time? I bet it most certainly will be, simply because he's, it's now 3 years later, 3.5 years later, he's been vilified even more, right? Especially if you're in the Black community, you're not going to tell anybody you're voting for him, because people, right, you'd be branded an Uncle Tom and all that horrible stuff that they say. But so, yeah, I think that there will be that component, but I don't think today Trump, even with all that factored in, is ahead of Biden. I still think Biden is winning, and if the dynamic doesn't change, would win. But I think the dynamic will change.
Okay, let's do a question from the chat. Mr. Alex Krijger, how tough will Trump and Biden be on China the coming 4 months? Do you think Biden will start being more tough on China, considering this is also one of the USPs of Mr. Trump?
Yeah. Hey, Alex. Good. Glad you could join us today. Good to always see you. I think Trump's going to be increasingly tough on China because politically speaking, it's a win for him. Joe Biden has said and done too much as vice president, as a senator, and then when he made the comment in Iowa about, come on, man, China's not our enemy. So it is a great contrast for Donald Trump, and so he will hit hard, I think, on China as much as he has to in order to win. So I think that will be the case. I think Biden will try to do some tough talking on China, but I think it's going to be problematic because of the stuff he's already done and said. And then this is also where his son, Hunter Biden, in the deal he got out of China when he flew with his dad there. He's vulnerable there, so that's going to get highlighted as well. So Biden's instinct is probably going to be to shy away from China bashing, but Trump will not. Trump and his affiliates will bash China like it was a piñata at a birthday party.
And how about Europe? Will Biden be as tough on Europe as Trump is?
No. Because look, this is a classic case of the left, right? The left loves to be feted in Europe. They love to be liked by the Europeans, and so Biden will kind of continue that tradition of Obama, John Kerry, right? That you saw, Al Gore, Bill Clinton. Whereas Trump doesn't care. I mean, I don't even think the man ever visited Europe before he was president. I don't know that. I know George Bush didn't. But he doesn't really care. Like, his view is, look, I'm going to get what I want, and Germany's not fair in terms of its trade policies, and they want to have that fight. Let's have that fight, because that's going to benefit Trump and his voters more than it won't, right? So Biden will not be tough on Europe, but Trump absolutely will be.
We have an interesting question from Christina Mertens. She says, in 2016, Trump released a list of possible Supreme Court picks. Do you think we can expect a similar move? And especially because this might motivate Christian conservatives to vote for Mr. Trump. One of his successes, I suppose, has been his picks of judges, not just for the Supreme Court, but also on a lower rank, the federal courts. So do you think he will again publish a list like this, and he will make this a strong argument for people to vote for him?
Without a doubt. Like, he's already talking about doing it. And this is what's so fascinating, right? Is Christine noted, in the last week or so, we've had these two different rulings three actually, right? You had the ruling on defining sex as sex orientation and gender identification, which many Americans don't get. Then you had the Louisiana abortion case yesterday, where Chief Justice Roberts actually was the fifth vote, and he was a George Bush appointee. And then before that, there was the vote on the immigration, the DACA, the Dreamers. these folks that were brought here by their parents, so they're not here legally, but they've grown up here, and trying to solve that problem. They voted against Trump on that, and again, that was a John Roberts issue, who was a Bush appointee. And so what's interesting about that is, some people think that that's going to hurt Trump because it's going to de-emphasize the role of the court. I think that's completely not the case. I think it's going to embolden Trump and the conservatives to say, look, this is exactly why we need 4 more years, because even when we get judges on there, they always end up wimping out and going to the left eventually. So we can't rest upon a 6-3 or 5-4 majority. We've got to get a 7-2 conservative majority, so that way when a Chief Justice Roberts squishes out on us, we still have enough votes to win the cases. So I think it will actually strengthen his ties with the Christian community in America, and it will embolden us. And remember, last week, Mitch McConnell in the majority of the Senate, they confirmed the 200th appellate or judge under Trump, which is a humongous number. There is today not a single vacancy in the appellate courts in America, which means Trump is transforming that court, and they'll make that argument to continue to do that, because look, they're going to say, look, Ruth Bader Ginsburg is on death's door. At some point, she's going to resign. She can't last another 4 years. So if we get Trump in there and keep the Senate, then we can get another Supreme Court justice, and possibly Clarence Thomas could step down, so we could replace him with another good person like him. So the court's going to be a very big battle scene, because the opposite is, you're going to get more of these left-wing folks out of Biden that will change the country in the other direction. So that'll be a fight for sure. And I know Tanya had asked about the outcome for the U.S. Senate. So let me take a second on that. So right now, it looks like it's like 48 Republican, 48 Democrat, with 4 toss-ups. What's going to be interesting is to see what happens with Susan Collins in Maine. Will she keep her seat? Cory Gardner in Colorado. I think Cory will lose. I think Susan will win. What will happen in Alabama? I think that's going to go back to the Republican side. And what happens in Michigan with the current senator who's being challenged by an African American? That's a pretty close race in Michigan. So that's going to be a crapshoot. But it's really important because if Trump wins, but we lose the Senate, they'll stop Supreme Court nominees and other things like that, right? If Trump wins and they keep the Senate, then they're going to continue. They're going to get more of these judges over the next 4 years. If Trump loses, but they keep the Senate, then they can block Biden. And then, right, you can do the game theory on this. So the Senate really is where the game is. The House is less important. It'd be nice to have it because then they could get lots of stuff done if they kept the Senate in the presidency. But the Senate is where the game is because, again, the ability to stop judges from getting into the courts. And unfortunately, in the last 40 years, the courts have become where the American battle scenes are. I mean, you think about the hot button issues, those have all come out of the courts. And that's not how our system was supposed to be designed. It was supposed to be a fight between the president and Congress, really. But it's now become who controls the court controls America, which is really bad. I mean, if you think about it, what you're saying is 5 men or women are really governing America, and they're not ever elected. They have lifetime tenure, and what they think matters. And everyone on the Supreme Court, since they were 18 years old, has spent their entire lives in the most elite institutions in America. So they're completely disconnected from places like Ohio or the flyover country, right? They have literally been in either Harvard or Yale, and Harvard or Yale Law School. Then they've been in wealthy law firms, and then they became judges. And then, so they haven't lived the real life that many Americans have lived since they were 18 years old. And again, I think that's a problem if you're going to talk about being governed by them. And increasingly we have been, and that's what's causing so much political strife in America, is what the court decides becomes the next battle.
About the Senate, if the Republicans lose the majority in the Senate, they already lost it in the House. Some pundits, experts, they say, whether they are from the left or from the right, they argue that Mr. Trump has kind of taken hostage of the Republican Party. If they lose the Congress, will this change anything for the Republican Party? Do they think, okay, so maybe we shouldn't have embraced Mr. Trump as we did?
Yeah, so I think, so everyone's thinking that, Trump has hijacked or changed the Republican Party. I actually don't think that's accurate. I think he is a after effect of where the party was going, no less than the left is increasingly becoming progressive. And that's why Bernie Sanders has been doing so well the last few years, right? Is the parties are becoming more and more of themselves, right? Conservative on one side, progressive on the other. And this is that we're under somewhat of a realignment, right? Where you have these blue collar Democrat voters in places like Eastern Ohio, Western Pennsylvania, Michigan, that were auto workers or steel workers. For decades, those were hardcore Democrat votes. Their union said vote Democrat, they did. Those have all become now Republicans because they've seen how trade has totally killed their lifestyles and their communities, right? And they saw that the Democrats did nothing to help them. Neither did the Republicans, but that's where Trump came along and gave voice to this idea that fair trade shouldn't be focused on the environmental mumbo jumbo. Fair trade should be focused on making sure the American worker is protected from cheap labor in China, theft in China, things like that, right? So this is where we're seeing a switch from some voters are moving in different directions. And that's where the Hispanic vote is up in the air. And that's where I think you're going to now see, because of this, believe it or not, this protest and all the riots out of Minneapolis that have spread, I actually think you're going to see an increasing number of Black Americans rethink their allegiance to the Democrat Party. Because again, if you're a Black American living in an urban center for the last 50 years since the Civil Rights Act passed, and you've been governed by Democrat mayors, Democrat city councils, with Democrat governors, and then you just had 8 years of a Democrat African-American president, and nothing actually changed in your life, it makes you start to wonder, why am I continuing to vote for these folks that have not improved my life? Maybe I should give this other side a chance to see what might happen. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but just watch what happens in the coming months and years to see if that's the case. But I think increasingly will be, Robert.
Okay. Mr. Gert Timmerman, who is attending, he asked you a question about character and leadership style. either to the advantage or disadvantage of either of both candidates. Can you explain something about this? You already mentioned about the image of Mr. Biden. 40% of the voters apparently thinks he is losing it, to put it mildly. We all know about the character of Mr. Trump. Can you tell us something more about this?
Yeah, absolutely. So this gets into one of the weaknesses for Trump, right? The Democrats are going to want to make this an election, a referendum on Donald Trump's character and leadership style, right? He is brazen and brusque. He tweets stupid things. He offends people left and right. And so if they can focus, more they can focus on Trump, the more they can say, is that how we want our president to act, right? And I think that that's a smart move for them. I mean, that's what happened in 2018 with the midterm elections, which is why the Democrats won, because suburban white women moved from Trump over to the Democrats, and that's what flipped the House in 2018. The question was, will that work in 2020? And it could work. I mean, it's a smart approach to campaigning, and that's where Biden can come across as somebody who's a bit different, right? He is vice president already. He was a U.S. senator. And so that's a good contrast that if I were on the left, I would absolutely push that as the point of the election is we need change in leadership because this guy's just bad for America. I'm not sure it will sell at the end of the day because, again, you have bigger issues like the economy, China, that I think are going to take front and center. But yeah, it's a legitimate thing to go after because it's an advantage for the left and a disadvantage for the right without any doubt about that. I mean, there are enough voters that find Trump's personality toxic and they won't vote for them. So getting those folks into your column for sure is a smart move on the left's part for sure.
And that's also to do probably with why not so many voters went out to vote, not so many Democratic voters out in 2016 for Hillary Clinton. Some people say she was not likable enough. It's important to be likable. There needs to be a candidate who you might want to have a beer with. You can drink a beer with Obama. You can drink a beer with Clinton, with Bush Jr., even with Trump compared to Mrs. Clinton. But if you could choose between Trump and Biden, who would you rather drink a beer with? Isn't this a big advantage for Mr. Biden compared to Ms. Clinton?
So there's a lot there. So let me first. So Jorrit Vandenberg, he put a comment that he can't find the police data. So just email me, Jorrit, and I'll send you the link so that you can look at the data on your own when this is over. And Bram and the folks at the Atlantic Commission will have my email contact. So just ping me and I'll get that information to you. So that's what's interesting. If you ask Americans who they want to have a beer with, now Trump doesn't drink, so that's what's interesting, right? But I guarantee you, a vast majority would say Trump. Because the guy's just entertaining as hell, right? I mean, he is just, you may not like him, but boy, having a beer with Biden would be mind-numbingly boring. It'd be like having a beer with your grandpa, which I would do that from a nostalgic standpoint, but, you know, not somebody else's grandpa, right? But Trump is just Trump. I mean, that's why he sucks the oxygen out of the room whatever room he's in, because he is this larger-than-life, charismatic, odd, but entertaining guy, and that's why he's been so successful. So the beer question is one that I think would hurt him. Now, Robert, you know, from the 2016 election, remember we had more people vote than ever before. So it wasn't that people didn't come out for Clinton; it's that more came out for Trump in the right places. Remember, she won the popular vote. But this is why, to Alex's question that he wanted about who will be Biden's VP. You can go on my opportunityohio.org website and look at a speech I gave a year ago in New York and in Aspen, Colorado, where I said if Biden's the candidate, which he would be, he will pick Kamala Harris as his VP. And I said that over a year ago. You can go listen to the video. And the reason I say that is because the Democratic Party is worried that if they don't have a minority on the ticket, the black vote will not come out like it did for Obama in 08 and 12. And if the black vote does not come out for the Democrat, again, mathematically, it becomes harder to win in those key states that are the battlegrounds. And so that's why I think he will pick Kamala Harris at the end of the day as his VP candidate, because they were going to want that minority candidate in order to drive out the black vote. The problem with Kamala Harris is she didn't inspire the black vote in the primary. So what makes you think she's going to inspire them in a general? And this gets into that silent minority. And she's got some problems where, you know, she joked about how she, you know, she used to smoke marijuana while she was locking up tons of black young men in California for drug violations, right? So there's going to be some issues there that she's vulnerable, but he's going to have to roll the dice because he's going to need a minority on the ticket if he's going to have any chance of driving out the vote in that direction, which is what they think they need.
All right, we're almost out of time, but there's one more question that I find fascinating. If the polls turn out to be still bad in October or November, end of October, and the pandemic is still going on, do you think there might be a chance that that Mr. Trump will postpone or cancel the elections?
Lord, no. That's a lovely talking point from the left, but no, I mean, he has no power to do that. Elections are governed by secretaries of states and board of elections in counties all across America. The president actually has zero capability to stop that, like literally zero capability. So the election will happen on November 3rd. I can guarantee you it would happen. It will be how it happens: mail-in voting, absentee voting, in-person voting. That's going to be where the fight's going to be. But just keep in mind, you know, when people talk about, oh, voter suppression and all that kind of stuff, like they just did in this election in Georgia, oh, voter suppression. The places where they said there was voter suppression of the black vote were in counties run by Democrats, with election people that were Democrats, and in some cases minorities. So this idea that like there's this great Republican effort to suppress the vote is just, again, it's more myth than fact. And Alec, you added this Val Demings, and I will say to you, who? Nobody knows who Val Demings is. She's an obscure congresswoman from Florida. Florida is not going to be lost because some obscure congresswoman is there, no more than Wisconsin went for Romney, which it didn't because Paul Ryan was on the ticket, and he at the time was the Speaker of the House, right? Congress people are small ball. No one's ever heard of them outside of their district. So she won't make a hill of difference in the election at all in Florida. And, you know, I don't see why he would pick her other than she may be a safer bet than Kamala Harris.
All right. Thank you very much, Matt. Is there still anything you left out and you still want to mention?
No, I mean, I think we've covered it. If anybody wants to ping me, just feel free to, you know, I'm on Twitter. I'm Ohio Matt, OhioMatt on Twitter. The website that has all my, you know, articles, speeches, and other stuff is www.opportunityohio.org. But feel free to ping me. I'm, as you know, Robbert and Bram and the folks there know, I'm always more than happy to send information and engage in conversations. And hopefully I'll be out there in the fall if we can make it, and I can meet some of you guys in person and see some of you I know well now, again, because it'd be great to spend some time and have a beer or a glass of milk.
All right. Thanks a lot, Matt. I would love to say the bar is open and let's continue the conversation with the beer, but it's still morning over there, and let's do it another day.
Yeah,
Thank you very much, everybody.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you.